To flip video 3.1, our first flip video for our culture unit. Our essential question for this flip video is, what is culture and how is it expressed? So let's start off with a basic definition of culture. So culture will be defined as a way of life that is defined by values, material artifacts, and political institutions. Values, of course, being what people place emphasis upon, what they value, what they believe in, what they think is important. Material artifacts are physical things, and political institutions of how the power is distributed over between groups of people and how the government itself is organized. Now, there's a couple of different things that are related to culture. The first one is called cultural ecology. So we've already talked about this first element of culture. And culture, we already discussed cultural ecology when we talked about environmental determinism and possibilism. So one of the first things that human geographers study with culture is how do cultures interact with their environment. And we discussed that either the environment determines the culture or the culture, it's possible for humans to overcome the challenges of culture from there. What I'd like to focus on is cultural geography. So go ahead and put on the left-hand side of your notes cultural geography, which is the field of human geography that studies how cultures vary over space. So cultural geography is essentially exactly what you and I are studying here in human geography. When we're looking at how culture varies over space, we're going to be examining all kinds of different components of culture. A lot of people will sort of default to the response that culture is just what people believe or what they practice. But that's expressed in so many different ways. Oh, here are the announcements. Hold on.
Lancaster, report to the main office.
So on the left-hand side of your notes, let's put lifestyles, because we're going to break down all the different components of how the human geographers study the cultural, how cultures vary over space. Human geographers look at people's lifestyles. So what are the defining characteristics of people's day-to-day existence? How do they spend their time? Who do they spend their time with? Is it communal? Is it individual? Why do people spend most of their day in religious settings? Is most of are food rituals significant? So the actual way in which people live, how they transport themselves over places, does that have significance? Are there specific values or beliefs that really dictate how it is that people live? Human geographers and cultural geography, we're looking at human relationships. So how do people interact with the earth? Look at relationships. Firstly, how do people interact with the earth, right? What role does the physical environment play in people's lives? We're going to look at certain ethnic faiths where the physical landscape is considered sacred, whereas in other kind of environments, that's really insignificant. What's the relationship that people have with supreme powers? What are their religious beliefs? How do those beliefs dictate their day-to-day lives? How do those beliefs dictate their clothes? How do those what women should wear, what women shouldn't wear, what men should do and shouldn't do, what should people eat and not eat? Those taboos we discussed in the early part of the school year. And finally, cultural geography, when looking at relationships, you're looking at what relationships are like with one another. What's considered permissible for relationships? What does dating look like? What does friendship look like? What does communal life and entertainment look like for people? Human geographers also look at creation. So what do people physically make to represent this culture? What kind of structures are built? What kind of physical buildings are built, right? Sports stadiums, or is it religious places, or is everyone very individualistic? Are there communal spaces? So all the physical things that people do to actually create that space and create those expressions of their cultures. Still under cultural geography here, cultural geography studies what do people value? What do they what do they spend their time doing? What kind of morals are supported by this culture? I kind of already mentioned this one too, but just time. How do people spend their time? So culture really supersedes just beliefs. It's not just music, it's not just clothes, it's not just food. It's everything that really connects a society. What do the people believe in? How does, for example, our belief in freedom of speech, how does that manifest itself in our day-to-day lives? How does our value of technology, how does that shape our day-to-day existence? These are all things that are really underpin culture, and they really dictate differences from groups of people over space. Culture is expressed in material and non-material ways. Material are physical things, and non-material are those ideas and beliefs and values. This is interconnected with what I just discussed about cultural geography. So when we're looking at culture, we can look at the material examples of culture. We can look at clothing. What is proper? What is improper? We can look at architecture. What kind of buildings are built? What kind of materials are they used? The physical materials of building often really relate to the physical environment and their expression of culture. So if you look at buildings, for example, in Southwest United States, and compare that to the Cape Cod style houses like you see here, right? This specific type of architecture is a reflection of culture, of the groups of people who came, the resources that they have available at that time. Where are those buildings found? Are they found in close proximity to one another? Is there, for example, an Islamic place in Islamic country or states, I should say, in Islamic regions in the Middle East, that the mosque will be the center point of the entire town? Is the building organized for multiple families? What role does the actual physical architecture play? We look for material culture, we see transportation systems, we look at technology as examples of material culture, and foodways. Foodways is a term that describes what people eat, right? So there's the culture behind food, which is a whole other thing to talk about as well, is that what's the significance of food, what kinds of things are used in the food, what's the lineage and the heritage of the food. So for example, just something kind of silly, but you can look at this is sort of stimulus diffusion here. We look at hot dogs, right, as a component of American culture. We have the California versus the barbecue style versus the Chicago and New York hot dog, right? Food as a material example of culture, and then of the customs of the people. Non-material culture. When we're looking at the ideas and values and beliefs of a society. And a government, who has power? How is power distributed? What does the government stand for? How does the government see its role in the society? Gender roles. What power do women have? What power do men have? Are they treated equally? What are the social expectations of the two? With the economy, how's the economy organized? How are goods and ideas distributed? How are resources shared? What's the role of money in this society? Is it a goal? Is it a means to an end? How does money and material life shape the existence of these people? Of course, religious beliefs is an excellent example of how the non-material culture. And generally visions of life, philosophies, how the world, the meaning of life, the meaning of human existence, how human beings interact with one another, all non-material things. And gestures and body language, those are non-material examples of culture. But for example, a handshake, what you and I associate with how you meet someone. In France, you've got the two kisses on the cheeks. There's societies when you do three kisses on the cheeks. And that's just the norm and the standard. Those are non-material examples of cultural expression that we will see how and why vary over space. One of the things I just want to briefly mention, that we've already talked about this gentleman, Carl Sager. He was the gentleman who discussed cultural landscapes. And remember, cultural landscapes are the physical imprint that humans create upon a space. So if we look out on the landscape, in what ways have human beings altered that landscape? Through our physical buildings, our transportation systems, what we build, what we create, what we do in the landscape. Carl Sager is really coming into play for a culture unit, because he's the one who says that that's the tool. The cultural landscapes are the tools of human geographers, because the landscapes represent people's lifestyle, it represents our relationships, and represents our creations. We can see all that by examining things like the cultural landscape of a mosque, and the role, for example, right here, this is called a minaret, and that minaret is a physical expression, a physical material example of a belief. And it is because that minaret is used to call people to prayer 5 times a day in majority Islamic places. So that cultural landscape is actually a representation of this people. We can draw conclusions about the dress. We can draw conclusions about the level of development of the region. So cultural landscapes are sort of the tool in our tool belt for this unit for analyzing culture. Now, generally speaking, so this is I just talked about the ways we express culture, the way we see culture. There are 2 types of culture that we'll be examining: pop culture and folk culture. Popular culture, of course, pop culture, and folk culture, which you could generally consider to be similar to quote-unquote traditional culture. These 2 types of culture, you don't need to copy this line down, but they differ in characteristics, in the hearth, which is the node where they begin, their diffusion, and their effects on the landscape. So let's start off with folk culture. Okay, so folk culture is going to be that traditional culture. It's what you associate with individual groups of people. There are specific customs, and usually it's a relatively small group of people. It's typically found in specific and rural areas. So folk culture is going to be very unique to a specific place. the beliefs, the customs, the practices are all going to be associated with a very specific place. And typically that's not transferable to a new place. Typically those beliefs, again, are very, very unique to a given area. The people who participate in this, and I'm sorry to include this now, but I would recommend that you have folk culture on the left, the definition on the right, and then distribution on the left, answer on the right, participants on the left, answer on the right, just so you got this nice and organized and for easy comparison with popular culture. The people who participate in this folk culture are going to be, it's a homogeneous population. That means homogeneous meaning same. Folk culture, that group of people, again, very relatively rural in nature. They're relatively isolated for the most part. That the folk culture will be quite homogeneous, and that the participants are all going to have a lot of commonalities and be very similar to one another. And by the way, the pictures I'm showing you are from a fantastic website that we're going to be using in class that can help us better visually understand the beauty that is folk culture and the unique, just the incredible diversity of human existence and of human cultural expression. This folk culture is the hearth of folk culture. Typically the hearth means its origin, its node, where it specifically began. Folk culture, the hearth is typically unknown. They're practices that have been passed down generation to generation from people to people. So those hearth cultures, those nodes of culture, are not things that are typically known and well expressed. So the hearth typically for folk culture is typically unknown, when it diffuses primarily through relocation diffusion. So people who practice these folk cultural traditions pass them on generation by generation to their descendants. And if they physically move, then the culture will go with them, right? So you bring your folk cultural practices with you. But for the most part, again, folk culture remains pretty isolated. It thrives in that isolation because the isolation ensures that the practices continue. The changes that folk culture experiences. Folk culture is static. Static means unchanging. So one particular area, so where, for example, this gentleman and his folk cultural practices, those are not going to change. He is not necessarily going to change those practices from generation to generation. But folk culture varies tremendously over space. So if we look at what folk cultural practices of Central Asia versus the folk cultural practices of South America versus North America, they vary tremendously over space, but very little over time, that the traditions remain in those folk cultural traditions. In terms of the interactions with the environment, folk culture has very deep interactions with the environment, the physical environment. Very often, nature, the physical environment itself, is found to be sacred. So, for example, we'll study in the top right the sacred nature of the Ganges River to many Hindus. That the folk cultural practices are quite often even based upon the physical environment itself, and then finding the sanctity and the sacred nature of that physical environment. So that explains why folk culture doesn't change over time, because, and more importantly, why folk culture is so specific to that place. Because if the practices are based upon the physical environment, then they're not going, the physical environment is not changing, so the practices themselves are not changing. And more importantly, that helps us understand why folk culture is so deeply connected to a very specific place. Kind of an example of environmental determinism, where the practices, just a little bit, where the practices are really dictating, or the physical environment is really dictating people's practices. Lastly, I already mentioned this, that folk culture is preserved through isolation. That is the isolation of these peoples and their practices that really preserves the traditions. That interactions with others brings in influence of popular culture and thus often leads to changes in the folk cultural practices. One key example of folk culture is the Amish. The Amish are a group of people who who live in the United States. They have very distinctive clothing and farming practices. And more specifically, the Amish are known for their religious belief in a life of simplicity, and consequently, they do not use electricity. They migrated from Switzerland, their heritage, in the 1700s. There's only about 70,000 in the United States now, but they're primarily isolated in these rural communities, particularly in Pennsylvania, scattered throughout the sort of northeast-ish into the central regions of the United States. But the Amish, I mean, or something you likely know, they're very unique dress and they very unique lifestyle. That's an example of folk culture, preserved through the isolation. An example that's relatively close to home here. Folk culture is truly what brings out the beautiful diversity of our world in so many ways. In contrast, pop culture. Pop culture are practices and customs that span across different groups of people and may even have a global influence. So pop culture Very key difference right off the bat. Pop culture spans across different cultures. So from here, we're talking about heterogeneous population. People that look, act, feel, are entirely different, still practicing common traditions. Great example of that are jeans, right? Jeans originated in the United States, diffused all over the world, and now people from on virtually, I'm going to make a bold claim here, I've never been to Antarctica, I have no clue, but I'd be willing to bet that even the scientists who exist on Antarctica are at some point in their existence wearing jeans. So jeans are an excellent example of this concept of popular culture. I just put Beyonce on there too, because who doesn't love Beyonce? So when we have pop culture here, there's the people that practice this again, our heterogeneous population, very diverse group of people, and that, again, that has a global influence. That pop culture is not tied to the environment or to specific practices of a place. So where does it come from? Pop culture comes, its hearth, its node, its place of origin comes from cities of MDCs. They're typically Western countries. The whole term Western is kind of confusing because in reality, the West, quote unquote, is a reflection of Western European countries, the United States and Canada. So these are countries whose cultural practices, they're quite similar in many different ways and have common origins in many ways. So the West is that dark blue that is highlighted here. So typically the cities of MDCs is where pop culture comes from. Pop culture is diffused hierarchically. Folk culture is word of mouth of people. Pop culture, we're talking hierarchically, specifically through technology. So that's where that whole globalization piece is coming back in. We've got people connecting over the internet, over social media, whatever. They've got connections, and that's primarily the way in which the practices of pop culture are going to spread. Talking about its changes, pop culture in contrast to folk culture, which is very static and unchanging. Pop culture is dynamic. It's constantly changing. It changes very little over space. So you go to California, you listen to Beyonce. You go to Italy, you listen to the same Beyonce. Changing very, very little over space, but greatly over time. So for example, let's look at some fashion, right? 1920s fashion with the style of more of a kind of like a flapper girl. 1980s, you got Salt and Pepper. I don't know. I just threw in this. I don't know if I'd really call this fashion, but at least those platform shoes, those puppies were very popular in the 1990s. So you can see fashion is an excellent example of how pop culture varies tremendously over time, but very, very little over space. Popular culture, again, is sort of uniform in that way. In terms of interactions with the environment, globalization, so the diffusion of technology over space, or the spread of common trends and common beliefs in those Western businesses moving into LDCs and so on and so forth. Globalization causes this uniform, same landscape. The folk culture was so deeply connected to the sacred landscape, whereas pop culture is not. The physical landscape is irrelevant, and the landscape doesn't account for local differences. So what that means is that this popular culture, so for example, the spread of KFC here into Asia, these things can actually negatively impact the environment. Not only does it create this uniform, very similar landscape. So now we're looking at the way in which a KFC looks in the United States is going to look exactly the same as the way KFC looks somewhere else in the world. That creates a very similar architectural style, and it creates that sort of flat look, whereas folk culture gives us that beautiful diversity in the world. So another great example, again, Starbucks, right? This cup of coffee at Starbucks you get is going to have the same logo. The store is largely going to be set up the same way, both here and in all over the planet. Similarly, McDonald's, right? We talked about McDonald's as stimulus diffusion that's going to change. What we are seeing, though, is a Western landscape that continues to be diffused all across space. Now, I mentioned this already, the way in which popular culture interacts with the environment. So popular culture, one of the problems with popular culture is that it increases the demand for natural resources. It's this kind of gimme, 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 gimme culture in contrast to the very respectful nature of folk culture where the environment is sacred. So for example, petroleum or oil, in our car culture of the United States, that really, as the concept of living by car spreads, or the lifestyle of living in a car spreads, that causes increased demand for oil. We've got animals, right? Diets. The hamburger is very, very popular. In fact, right now, globally, what's driving the massive, massive increase in beef consumption is actually the rising middle class in China. The rising middle class in China is demanding more and more red meat, which in turn is driving a really large global demand for red meat. Well, cows are actually very detrimental to the environment in many ways. That's kind of a big claim. Cows can have a negative impact on the environment, in particular if you're trying to raise animals that are not native to a particular place. That's an excellent example of how that McDonald's hamburger is actually causing sort of a negative overall impact on the United States or on the natural landscape. You can also get a whole lot more pollution if you get a more urbanized society. There's Doha down there. If we're looking at Doha as it compares to other places in the world, if everyone's building these massive cities and industrialized lifestyles, that in turn is going to drive greater pollution. Other examples, just generally speaking, driving a materialistic culture, right? One that we here today, gone tomorrow, acquire more things, more technology. If all these things are what's fulfilling us, that's going to lead to a lot of physical waste and pollution. Another interesting example is the fusion of golf. Golf is very much a Western tradition, but people in places where have no business creating golf courses, which require, of course, tremendous amounts of water and maintenance, they're completely altering the physical landscape in order to meet the demand to create more golf courses, really changing the physical environment. The popular, just an example with fashion, right? With more the demand for animal skins, then that's going to lead to the endangerment and extinction of animals, or ivory tusks, which thankfully is often being banned around the world, but still has a thriving market. Those kind of global demands can often very negatively impact places since they are not considerate of the needs of that place. Okay, there's the analysis questions. For number 1, that should be a long answer, because I want you to take on the role of a not ecologist, cultural geographer. And I want you to answer to describe your own individual culture. My culture and my heritage may be different than yours, right? Or your friends or whatever. But the point is, I want you to describe your own culture through the lens of your lifestyles, values, times, creations, and relationships. So all the questions I asked you back here about what cultural geographers look at, I'd like you to examine those and analyze those for your own culture. Describing the most significant difference between pop and folk culture, and why does the diffusion of popular culture often threaten the physical environment of a given place? That is it.